Some mistakes take years to catch up with you. Others arrive without warning. Mine arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon in the mountains. I wasn't supposed to be there. The trip had been canceled twice already. First because of work, then because of weather. By the third attempt, I almost didn't go. Looking back, I probably should have the mountain road twisted through endless pine forests. Dark clouds rolled overhead. Rain tapped against my shield. The weather report had promised a storm. But weather reports are usually wrong. At least that's what I kept telling myself. My destination was a small lakeside cabin resort hidden deep in the mountains. Quiet Reen. The kind of place people visited when they wanted to disappear for a few days. I had rented a cabin for a long weekend, no emails, no meetings, no phone calls, just peace, at least that was the plan. Halfway there, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen, on number. Normally, I would have ignored it. For some reason, I answered. Hello? A familiar voice replied. Ethan? I nearly drove off the road because I knew that voice, even after 3 years, even after everything. Margaret? There was a brief pause, then a relieved laugh. Thank goodness. I frowned. Why are you calling me? That's a long story. The answer immediately raised questions. A lot of questions. What happened? Another pause, then she sighed. I'm at the resort. I blinked. The same resort? Apparently. For a second, neither of us spoke. The coincidence felt ridiculous. Almost impossible. Margaret Lawson, my ex-wife's mother, 3 years without seeing her, 3 years without speaking, and somehow, we had booked the exact same mountain resort during the exact same storm. You're kidding. I wish I were, I laughed. Mostly because I didn't know what else to do. Outside, thunder rolled through the mountains, the rain grew heavier. Margaret's voice became more serious. Ethan, what? The manager just called. Something in her tone made me sit up straighter. The storm is worse than expected. My stomach tightened. How bad? The roads are closing. I looked through the windshield, rain hammered the glass. The sky had turned nearly black, and suddenly, the peaceful weekend I had planned didn't feel so peaceful anymore. Then Margaret said something that made everything even stranger. There's another problem. What problem? A long silence, then she answered. They accidentally gave our cabin to someone else. I frowned. What does that have to do with me? Another pause. Longer this time, then came the sentence neither of us expected to hear. Because now, we're the only two guests left without a place to stay. And somewhere beyond the mountains, the storm finally arrived. For several seconds, I genuinely thought Margaret was joking. Unfortunately, she wasn't. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Tell me exactly what happened. The sound of rain filled the line, then Margaret sighed. The resort overbooked. How does a mountain resort overbook? Apparently the same way airlines do. I laughed despite myself. That sounded exactly like something Margaret would say. Even during a crisis, the familiar feeling caught me off guard. 3 years had passed, yet somehow talking to her still felt natural, comfortable, like no time had passed at all. The manager called me 20 minutes ago, she continued. He said, most guests canceled because of the storm. Okay, but several unexpected travelers arrived before the roads closed. I frowned. I'm still missing the important part. Margaret hesitated. The important part is that there's only one cabin left. The answer hung in the air. Outside, lightning flashed across the mountains. I already knew where this conversation was going. I just didn't particularly want to hear it. The manager suggested. She stopped, then laughed nervously. He actually sounded embarrassed saying it. Margaret? What? Tell me. Another pause, then she finally said it. He suggested we share the cabin. I nearly missed a turn. You're kidding. I assure you, I am not. The absurdity of it hit me all at once. Out of every person in the world, out of every possible resort, out of every possible weekend, I was being asked to share a cabin with my ex-wife's mother during a storm in the middle of nowhere. For what could easily become several days, the universe clearly had a sense of humor. A terrible one, Margaret laughed softly. That was more or less my reaction. I pulled into the resort entrance a few minutes later. The place looked almost deserted. Wind bent the pine trees. Rain swept across the lake. Dark clouds covered the mountains completely. The storm looked worse than the forecast, much worse. A resort employee waved me toward the main lodge. As soon as I stepped inside, I spotted Margaret. Standing near the stone fireplace, for a moment, I forgot about the storm. She looked different, not older. Just different, more relaxed, more confident, a cream-colored sweater, dark jeans, hair loosely pinned back. She smiled when she saw me. The same warm smile I remembered from years ago. Ethan. Margaret. For a second, neither of us moved, then we both laughed because the situation was too ridiculous not to. The manager appeared a moment later looking extremely nervous. I am so sorry about this. He handed over a key card. There is one luxury cabin remaining. I looked at Margaret. She looked at me. Then the manager delivered the final piece of bad news. The roads are officially closed until the storm passes. Outside, thunder shook the windows. Inside, Margaret and I realized we weren't deciding whether to share a cabin. The storm had already made the decision for us. The drive from the main lodge to the cabin took less than 2 minutes. It felt much longer. Mostly because neither of us knew what to say. Rain hammered against the SUV, wind shook the trees. The narrow road curved along the edge of the lake, which had completely disappeared beneath darkness and storm clouds. Margaret sat quietly in the passenger seat, looking out the window, watching the storm. Occasionally glancing at the map the manager had given us, the silence wasn't awkward, not exactly, just unfamiliar. After all, there aren't many social guidelines for unexpectedly sharing a cabin with your ex-wife's mother. Eventually, Margaret broke the silence. You know, what? If we survive this weekend, we deserve some sort of award. I laughed, the tension eased immediately. I'll settle for indoor plumbing, reasonable. A few moments later, the cabin appeared through the trees. Warm lights glowed through large windows. The place was beautiful, far more beautiful than anything shown on the website. A massive stone fireplace, flue-to-sailing windows facing the lake, a wide wooden deck, and enough pine trees surrounding it to make the entire place feel isolated from the rest of the world. The storm somehow made it even more impressive. Wow, Margaret whispered. I nodded. Definitely not the worst place to get stranded. The moment we stepped inside, warmth surrounded us, the fireplace was already burning. Soft yellow lamps illuminated the living room, bookshelves lined one wall, a grand piano sat near the windows. The entire place felt more like a luxury home than a rental cabin. For a second, both of us forgot about the awkwardness. Until we found the bedrooms, there were only two doors. One opened into a large master suite, the other was locked. I frowned. A maintenance tag hung from the handle, out of service. Margaret read it twice, then looked at me. No. I looked again. Still out of service, still very real. The manager had apparently forgotten one important detail. The only usable bedroom was the master suite. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Margaret covered her face. Oh, this just keeps getting better. I laughed so hard I had to lean against the wall. The absurdity of it was impossible not to appreciate. The universe wasn't just creating problems, it was actively writing comedy. Eventually, Margaret lowered her hands. We can figure something out. Of course, I'll take the sofa. I shook my head. Absolutely not. Ethan, no. You're not sleeping on the floor, and you're not sleeping on the sofa. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, neither willing to give in. Then lightning flashed outside. The entire cabin shook from a distant crack of thunder. The storm wasn't getting weaker. It was getting stronger. And as we stood there in the warm glow of the cabin, both of us slowly realized that this weekend was already becoming far more complicated than either of us had expected. The argument lasted almost 15 minutes, not because either of us was angry, because neither of us was willing to lose. Margaret insisted she would take the sofa. I insisted she wouldn't. She reminded me she was older. I reminded her that was exactly why she wasn't sleeping on a sofa. She pointed out that I was being stubborn. I pointed out that she had apparently invented stubbornness. Neither of us made much progress. Eventually, Margaret crossed her arms. You always did this. I frowned. Did what? Decide something and refuse to change your mind. I laughed. That's rich coming from you. A smile appeared despite her best efforts. Fair. Outside, the storm continued to batter the cabin. Rain struck the giant windows. Wind howled through the trees. The lake had completely vanished beneath darkness. It felt like the entire world had disappeared, leaving only the cabin. And us. Finally, Margaret sighed. Fine. I narrowed my eyes suspiciously. Fine? Yes. You agreed too easily. I know. That worries me. She laughed. The sound echoed through the living room. Then she pointed toward the bedroom. We're adults. I blinked for a moment. My brain stopped working. Margaret immediately realized what I was thinking and burst out laughing again. Oh, for heaven's sake. My face probably looked ridiculous. That is not what I meant. I know. No, you clearly don't. Now I was laughing too. The tension that had followed us since the resort vanished almost instantly. For the first time since arriving, everything felt normal, or at least as normal as this situation could possibly be. A little later, we ordered dinner from the lodge before the kitchen closed. The delivery arrived just before the storm became too dangerous for staff to drive. After that, we were completely on our own. The cabin felt even more isolated. The fireplace crackled softly. Warm light filled the room. Margaret sat cross-legged on one end of the sofa. A blanket draped across her shoulders. I sat on the opposite side, eating takeout and pretending this was a perfectly ordinary evening. The strange thing was, it almost felt like one. Until Margaret suddenly asked, can I ask you something? I looked up. Depends. She smiled. Do you always avoid difficult conversations? Only the important ones. That's what I thought. I laughed, then noticed something. She wasn't really joking. There was something thoughtful in her expression, something she'd been carrying all evening. Maybe longer. The storm rattled the windows again. Margaret stared into the fire. For several seconds she didn't speak, then quietly said, "There are things I've wanted to tell you for a very long time." The room seemed to grow still. The fire continued to crackle. Rain continued to fall. But suddenly, nothing felt more important than the woman sitting across from me. And whatever she was finally preparing to say, the fire crackled softly between us. Outside, the storm showed no signs of slowing down. Rain lashed against the windows. Wind rattled the cabin walls. The entire mountain seemed to be shaking beneath the weight of the weather. Yet inside, everything felt strangely calm. Margaret sat quietly on the sofa, her eyes fixed on the flames. For a moment, I thought she had changed her mind, that whatever she wanted to tell me would remain unspoken. Then she stood, without saying a word, crossed the room, and walked toward an antique wooden desk near the fireplace. I watched her open one of the drawers. She stared inside for several seconds, as though gathering courage. Then she removed something. A folded envelope, old, worn around the edges. Carefully preserved, she returned to the sofa and sat down again. The envelope rested in her hands. Immediately, I knew it mattered. People don't carry something that old unless it means something. "What's that?" I asked. Margaret looked down at it, then smiled sadly. "A mistake." That wasn't the answer I expected. "A mistake?" She nodded. "The biggest one I've ever made." The room fell quiet. I waited. Eventually, she turned the envelope over. There was no address, no stamp, nothing, just age, years of age. "I wrote this letter 3 years ago." My stomach tightened. 3 years, the same year as the divorce. Margaret noticed my expression. Yes, the same year. The realization hit me immediately. The letter wasn't random. It had something to do with me. The question was how much. "You wrote it after Claire and I separated?" She nodded. I stared at the envelope, suddenly far more interested than I wanted to admit. "What does it say?" Margaret laughed softly. "That's the problem." "What problem?" "I never sent it." The answer somehow made the mystery worse. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. Inside, the firelight danced across the room. Margaret gently traced her thumb across the edge of the envelope. For a moment, she looked almost nervous, which surprised me. Margaret had always seemed fearless, calm, certain. Now she looked like someone standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump. "I must have rewritten it 20 times. She smiled faintly. "Maybe 30. That bad?" "Worse." I couldn't help smiling, then her expression became serious again. "I told myself I wasn't sending it because it wasn't appropriate." She looked down. "But that wasn't the real reason." I waited. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background. Everything faded into the background. Then Margaret finally looked up, directly at me, and quietly said, "The truth is, I was terrified of what would happen if you actually read it." The words settled heavily between us, and for the first time that weekend, I realized that whatever was inside that envelope had the power to change everything. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The envelope rested in Margaret's hands, the fire crackled softly, rain continued to strike the windows, and somewhere beyond the darkness, thunder rolled across the mountains. I couldn't stop looking at the letter. 3 years, 3 years she'd carried it. 3 years she'd never mailed it. 3 years she'd never mentioned it. Part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know what it said. The other part couldn't think about anything else. Margaret stared down at the envelope, then smiled nervously, a look I'd never seen on her before. "You know what? I've imagined this moment hundreds of times." I laughed softly. "That doesn't sound healthy." It wasn't. That made both of us smile, but only briefly because the seriousness quickly returned. Margaret carefully opened the envelope. The paper inside looked old, folded countless times, the edges slightly worn, as if she'd taken it out repeatedly over the years, only to put it away again. Without sending it, she looked at the first page, then at me. "I'm suddenly reconsidering this." I leaned back. "That's probably a bad sign, a very bad sign." For a second, she almost looked ready to laugh. Instead, she took a deep breath and began reading. "Dear Ethan." Her voice was quiet, gentle, almost fragile. "By the time you read this, you will probably be angry with me." I frowned. Margaret glanced up. "See? Bad start. Continue." She nodded, then continued reading. "I know this isn't my place. I know I should probably stay out of it. But watching someone you care about suffer and doing nothing becomes its own kind of mistake." The cabin felt completely silent. Even, the storm seemed farther away now. Margaret swallowed, then kept going. "You spent years trying to make Claire happy. Nobody saw all of it, but I did." My chest tightened because those words felt real, painfully real. Margaret looked away from the page for a moment, then continued. Sometimes people can love each other and still be wrong for each other. That doesn't make either person the villain, it only makes them human. I stared into the fire, not because I was uncomfortable, because I felt understood. In a way I hadn't expected. Margaret lowered the paper slightly. There was more. I looked up. Her expression had changed again, more vulnerable now, more exposed. What kind of more? A sad smile appeared. The dangerous kind. The answer immediately made my heart beat faster. Margaret looked at the remaining pages, then quietly admitted, "This is the part I could never bring myself to send." Outside, lightning illuminated the lake. Inside, the firelight flickered across the room. And for the first time that night, I realized the rest of the letter wasn't about my marriage. It wasn't about Claire. It wasn't about the divorce. The rest of the letter was about us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The letter remained open in Margaret's hands. The fire crackled softly, wind howled outside the cabin, and somewhere deep in the mountains, thunder rolled across the lake, but inside, everything had become very still. Margaret stared at the remaining pages, as though she were looking at a younger version of herself, a version she wasn't sure she recognized anymore. I should probably stop here. I looked at her. Do you want to? No. The answer came immediately, honest, instinctive, and somehow sad. She looked down at the letter again, then slowly continued. There is something I haven't been honest about. Her voice grew quieter. Not with Claire. Not with my family. Not even with myself. I felt my pulse quicken. The firelight danced across the pages. Margaret paused briefly, then kept reading. After the divorce, I kept telling myself I was worried about you because you had been part of our family. Because I cared about your well-being, because I didn't like seeing someone hurt. She swallowed. The next word seemed harder. Much harder. But eventually, I realized those weren't the real reasons. The room felt smaller somehow, warmer, closer. Margaret's hands tightened slightly around the paper. The truth is, I missed you. The words settled heavily between us. Neither of us moved. Neither of us looked away. Margaret stared at the page, not at me, almost as though reading the words was easier than saying them directly. I missed your phone calls. I missed your terrible jokes. I missed the way you always offered to help before anyone asked. A small laugh escaped me. Margaret smiled faintly, without looking up. Then continued. Most of all, I missed the feeling that someone truly understood me. The cabin seemed completely silent. Only the storm remained. Only the fire. Only us. Margaret lowered the letter for a moment. Her eyes glistened in the firelight. That was the part I could never send. I understood why. Because this wasn't a letter about grief, or family, or divorce. It was a letter about feelings she hadn't wanted to admit. Maybe not even to herself. She looked back down at the final page. One page remained. Just one. And somehow, I knew it contained the words she'd been avoiding for 3 years. Margaret took a deep breath, then read the final paragraph. Maybe one day these feelings will disappear. Maybe time will do what time is supposed to do. But if it doesn't, I hope life gives me one more chance to tell you the truth. Her voice trembled slightly. Then came the final line, the line she'd never mailed, the line she'd hidden for 3 years. The line that explained everything. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, then whispered, because losing Claire was painful, but losing you felt like losing someone I was never supposed to lose. The fire crackled softly, the storm raged outside, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, there was nothing left hidden between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The letter lay quietly in Margaret's lap. The fire continued to burn, the storm continued to rage, but everything else seemed to disappear. I couldn't stop thinking about those final words. Losing you felt like losing someone I was never supposed to lose. 3 years. 3 years she'd carried those feelings. 3 years she'd hidden them. 3 years she'd convinced herself the letter should never be sent. And somehow, fate had trapped us together in a cabin during the worst storm of the season. The irony wasn't lost on me. Margaret carefully folded the letter. Her hands trembled slightly. I shouldn't have read that. I looked at her. Why? A sad smile appeared. Because now you know. Know what? She laughed softly, as if the answer were obvious. Everything. The vulnerability in her voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the calm, confident woman I remembered. This was someone standing completely exposed, someone who had finally stopped hiding. Outside, lightning illuminated the lake. For a brief moment, the entire cabin glowed white, then darkness returned. Margaret looked toward the fireplace, unable to meet my eyes. I don't expect anything. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't bring you here. I didn't plan this. I don't want you to feel obligated to say something. I listened quietly because interrupting felt impossible. She smiled sadly. I only wanted you to know the truth. The truth, such a simple word, yet it carried the weight of years. I stared into the fire, thinking. Not about the letter, not about the storm, about the last 3 years. The loneliness, the missed opportunities, the feeling that something important had ended before I understood what it was. Then I realized something. Something that had been quietly growing all night. Something I hadn't wanted to examine too closely, because once I admitted it, I looked at Margaret, really looked at her, the woman who had always understood me. The woman who had somehow seen parts of me that even Claire never fully understood. The woman who had crossed mountains carrying a letter she never intended to send. And suddenly, the answer became impossible to ignore. Margaret, her eyes lifted toward mine. Slowly, carefully, almost afraid. Yes? I smiled, a small smile, but a genuine one. You know what bothers me most about that letter? Confusion crossed her face. What? I leaned back slightly, then shook my head. You should have sent it. For a second, she simply stared at me, completely stunned. The storm continued outside, the fire continued to crackle, but inside the cabin, something changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough for hope to enter the room. And for the first time that night, Margaret smiled without sadness, without fear, without regret. A beautiful smile, the kind that belongs to someone who is finally beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, the story isn't over yet. Neither of us said much after that. Not because there was nothing left to say, because there was suddenly too much. The fire burned lower. The storm continued beyond the windows, and somehow the cabin felt smaller, warmer, more intimate than it had only an hour earlier. Margaret sat quietly beside the fireplace. The letter rested on the coffee table between us. No longer hidden, no longer secret. For 3 years it had existed in silence. Tonight, it had finally been heard. I stood and walked toward the large windows overlooking the lake. Outside, rain was beginning to weaken. The violent winds had calmed. The storm was slowly losing its strength. Margaret joined me a moment later, standing beside me, close enough that I could hear her breathing, far enough that neither of us felt pressured. For a while, we simply watched the lake dark, silent, waiting for morning. Then Margaret spoke. I spent years convincing myself that I was doing the right thing. I looked at her. By staying away? She nodded. I thought distance would solve everything. A small smile appeared. It turns out distance is remarkably useless. I laughed. That's one way to put it. She looked down, then quietly admitted, I followed your career. I blinked. What? Her cheeks turned slightly red, a reaction I never expected from Margaret Lawson. I checked your company website. I laughed. That's surprisingly specific. It gets worse. Oh, she sighed dramatically. I may have looked at your social media once or twice. Once or twice? Fine, she smiled. More than once or twice. The confession made both of us laugh. The tension that had followed the letter eased, not disappeared, just softened. Outside, the clouds began to break apart. A faint glow appeared beyond the mountains. Morning was coming. Margaret noticed it too. Looks like the storm is ending. I nodded. Neither of us mentioned what that meant because we both knew. When the roads reopened, this strange weekend would end, reality would return. The question wasn't whether we would leave, the question was what happened after. Margaret folded her arms, staring toward the horizon. You know something? What? I almost didn't come on this trip. I smiled. So did I. She looked at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she laughed softly. Imagine that. Two different people. Two separate decisions, 1,000 opportunities for circumstances to change, yet somehow, we had ended up here, together, watching the storm disappear. Margaret's smile slowly faded, not sadly, thoughtfully. Then she turned towards she entered me, her eyes steady, honest, hopeful, and asked the question both of us had been avoiding since the letter was opened. What happens when we leave this cabin, Ethan? The fire crackled softly behind us. Morning light crept across the lake. And for the first time all weekend, the future stood directly in front of us, waiting for an answer. The question lingered between us. What happens when we leave this cabin, Ethan? For a moment, I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, because I wanted to be certain. Outside, the storm had finally surrendered. The clouds were breaking apart, sunlight spilled across the lake. The mountains that had been hidden for 2 days slowly emerged from the mist. Everything looked different, cleaner, brighter, as if the world itself had survived something. Maybe we had too. Margaret stood beside the window waiting, not pressuring me, not expecting anything, just waiting. The same way she'd waited 3 years to send a letter she never mailed. I looked at her. At the woman who had spent years convincing herself that silence was the right choice. The woman who had carried feelings she believed she could never admit. The woman who had somehow become the most unexpected part of my life. And suddenly, the answer felt simple. I think we stopped pretending. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. I smiled. That's what happens. Neither of us looked away. For the first time all weekend. There were no secrets left. No unfinished conversations, no hidden letters. Only truth. The kind that arrives late, but arrives anyway. A notification suddenly buzzed on my phone. Roads reopening. 12 p.m. reality had officially returned. The weekend was ending. Margaret glanced at the screen, then toward the lake. A small smile appeared. Well, well, neither of us sounded particularly excited about leaving. A few hours later, the cabin was packed, bags sat near the door, the fireplace had burned low, the resort staff were clearing fallen branches from the roads, everything was ready. Everything except us. We stood outside near the lake before leaving. The air was cold, fresh, the world smelled like rain and pine trees. Margaret slipped her hands into her coat pockets. I never thought I'd be grateful for a storm. I laughed. Neither did I. She looked toward the mountains, then back at me. I almost burned that letter. The confession surprised me. You did? A dozen times. What stopped you? She smiled softly. Hope. The answer hit me harder than I expected, because hope is a dangerous thing. It asks people to believe in outcomes they cannot control. And somehow, she had held on to it anyway. For 3 years, I stepped closer, not dramatically, not like a movie, just enough to make sure she knew she wasn't alone anymore. You know? I said. What? If you had mailed that letter, she smiled, we wouldn't be standing here. Probably not. The realization made both of us laugh because life rarely follows the route people plan. Sometimes it takes detours, storms, missed chances, years of silence, only to bring people exactly where they were meant to be. Margaret looked at me, the same beautiful smile I'd seen the night we met again. Only this time, there was no sadness behind it, no regret, only possibility. Then she reached into her pocket and handed me something. A small folded note. I opened it. Inside was a phone number, and beneath it one sentence. This time, don't make me wait 3 years. I laughed. She laughed too. The sound echoed across the quiet lake. Then together, we walked toward our cars, toward uncertainty, toward whatever came next. The storm was over. The letter had finally been read. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of us was looking backward anymore. We were looking forward together.